I'm thrilled to be moderating the last of today's panel discussions now, exploring the issue of peace and how individuals can become involved in peace activism. Joining me are Libyan peace and human rights activist, co-founder of Together We Build It, Hajar Sharif. Ria Mahanta, who is a United Nations volunteer at the United Nations Mission in South Sudan, Department of Peace Operations, and founder of the Peacebuilding Project, an organization dedicated to the academic instruction of conflict resolution and outreach towards afflicted communities. And multi-award-winning documentary filmmaker, entrepreneur, social justice activist from Toronto, Canada. Welcome back, Cash Up panelists. Welcome. Great to see you all. Are you okay? I'd like to hope yes. So as with all of today's panel's discussions, we're going to begin with the basics, really, panelists. So what does peace mean to you? Hajar, let's start with you.
Well, it's a very good question, and it's perhaps the most important question that should be asked to everyone. And I wish if this question was asked to all of us in our first day at school ever, because it is important for every one of us to reflect on what peace means to them. For me, I feel my definition of peace evolved over the time, and that's primarily because of the situation in my country, Libya. As most of you know, it went through several civil wars by now. And all in all, I would say the definition of peace that I personally hold into is to solve conflicts, to accept differences without the need to resort to violence. I would say this is peace for me after seeing my country going through 10 years of war.
Exactly, keywords. Without the need to resort to violence. I love that. Ria, what about you?
Thank you, Will, and hello to everyone watching. And to my fellow panelists as well. It's very nice to be here with you all today. Peace, to me, my definition is from a very conflict resolution practitioner's perspective. I think it's about coherence and harmony, whether that is internal between our value systems and our actions, or external between one community's needs and interests versus another's. So I think peace is finding the harmony and balance between those competing needs and interests. Over to you, Will.
Exactly. Wonderfully said. And Kasha, what does peace mean to you?
Thank you so much. So to me, peace is really about equity, inclusion, and justice for all. We can't achieve peace unless the human rights of everyone are honored and people have access to those rights. And peace to me also requires that we treat our earth with respect and care instead of simply as a resource for our own extraction. And that's why the Sustainable Development Goals are really important, especially SDG 16 focusing on peace as a guide in assuring that all life on earth has access to that same quality of care, and that we're striving towards goals that are going to hold leaders accountable for achieving peace.
Exactly. Wonderfully said. But I think one of the most bizarre things, in my opinion, is that the most violence actually happens in our homes, schools, communities, and places of work. So I want to ask, why are we so violent, Ria?
I think we become violent because of our insecurities, whether they are physical, such as like resources, land, water, territory, or if they're psychological, like power or human dignity and the need for growth. So we become violent either to fulfill these unmet needs or out of perceived fear that our human needs are mutually exclusive, that another group meeting their needs would by default mean that there is less for us, which is not necessarily the case. There's always a creative solution if we're able to get to the root cause of a problem. But I think we turn violent when our survival instincts and our self-interests kick in. And that is because we have not yet realized that our self-interests are intrinsically connected to the collective interest. And the day we are able to understand that link between the individual and society is when we will start perceiving the need for violence differently.
Yep, exactly. There is always a creative solution. Kasha, why are we so violent?
I think that's a really important question to ask ourselves. I think it comes from a lot of the structures that we have in place that are dominating our society. When leaders continue to invest in and uphold systems that are inequitable and oppressive, it's really hard to create conditions that are peaceful for people. Like when Indigenous peoples are criminalized for defending their treaty lands against industrial exploitation, the US upholding for-profit prison systems, incentivizing incarceration of BIPOC peoples. When we as a world are spending over $2 trillion a year in militarism, anytime that governments, corporations choose greed and profit over peace, planet, and people, it becomes really hard to create the conditions for sustainable peace. And how can we create those conditions when human rights are treated as luxuries?
Exactly. And Hajar, why are we so violent?
Well, it's a very good question. To be honest, I think it's very difficult to answer. It all comes down to the root causes of each, let's say, type of violence. But very generally, at least in my opinion, I think one of the reasons is perhaps this embedded wish in some of us, because it's also a fact that not all of us are violent, but the wish in some of us to become somehow superior, thinking that by being superior to others, then you will gain more, you will be respected more, because in some parts of the world, including like in my country now, if you look at the situation in Libya, violence seems to be a way to gain respect by spreading fears, right? But this does not only happen in situations of wars. It happens even, as you said earlier, at homes, at schools. So I think it's really this embedded wish in some of us to become superior and not recognizing that each one of us have their full agency to proceed whatever they want to do, actually.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I did mention that violence happens in schools, homes, communities, places of work. But actually, a lot of the violence now is happening online. And all of us are online, aren't we? Whether we're on Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. And it's almost quite easier for violence to happen online now. Ria, what do you think of this? Do you feel like maybe the growth of, digital media is contributing to more violence now in the world and society?
It certainly is a platform for more hate speech and ethnocentrism. And we see that in the case of South Sudan as well, because the violence doesn't just happen online and stay online, but it kind of relegates outside of that realm and influences politics and conflict dynamics on the ground. So one hate speech or one comment can trigger a violent incident on the ground. And I think this is because, of course, the mediums of digital media are more available to us, are more easily accessible to everyone. But it's really up to us how we use it. So there needs to be more awareness about what these platforms are actually made for. They're not to incite more violence. We need to be educated about how we can constructively use these platforms to connect with societies and preach peace and not war.
Exactly. Preach peace and not war. Kasha, what do you reckon? Digital media, the rise of digital media, is it just making things worse?
I think it can be a tool for social good. It can also be a tool for violence and hate speech, as Ria mentioned. Even mainstream media, new media, these are all platforms where sensationalism, stereotypes, and misinformation can be leveraged. And so ensuring that we have access to information that is truthful, that is balanced, and that also takes into account when we're looking at global issues, the most marginalized populations' experiences. We have to, I think as a media maker, we have responsibilities in the way that we create media and educational resources. And also, it comes down to the way that we have a culture of peace, or do we have a culture of violence? So facilitating spaces where we can create more peaceful cultures online is also really important too.
Exactly. And moving on to my next question now. What are the greatest threats to humanity's survival, Hajar?
Well, I feel you gave me the $1 million question. That is very easy to answer, actually. There is a lot. And perhaps that's also why many of us are anxious, and that's why even more and more young people are getting anxious and stressed about everything that is happening. There is conflict, there is increasing levels of violence, there is climate change, there is racial injustice, there is gender inequality. And you know what all of these issues have in common is that they are not new. They have been there forever. There are many people and different groups who've tried to tackle them, who've tried to address them. And it seems that regardless of what's happening on the grassroots level, you know, we see mass movements, we see protests where young people, students are leading these protests and participating fully. It seems that it really sort of the progress stops when it comes to the decision-making level. And that being said, if we want to be the generation who will truly make a difference, and be distinguished by not just saying, you know, in a few years' time, we've tried to do our best, but actually saying we managed to make a difference, then we need to get ourselves into the decision-making table. You know, more of us needs to sit there, more of us needs to influence that decision-making table, because apparently, regardless of how much you mobilize on the ground, you need to make the right decisions. And as we've seen, unfortunately, not all world leaders have been making the decisions needed throughout the past decades.